Okay, welcome to Chapter 2. This is, again, continuing our lectures in the text Criminal Justice in Action, the Core. This is ninth edition, Larry Gaines and Roger Leroy Miller. We're going to be handling Chapter 2 today, which is going to be looking at the data and the tools we use to measure and explain crime. We'll also be looking at a few matters close to those. Hopefully that'll give you a little bit more context. And again, there'll be a series of micro lectures that you should find at the bottom of Blackboard if you're following along here. So enjoy those too. We'll mention them when we get to them. Okay, again, here are your learning objectives. These are just a little bit of basic information, things we seek to accomplish for this particular chapter that relate to overall goals for the course. You don't have to know these in a sense, except that these are what we're aiming to accomplish. Okay, the first thing to talk about is categorization of crime. One of the ways in which we understand the universe and understand phenomenon is we break it down into models or categories. We certainly do that with crime. We do it with disease, for example. We would say some diseases are caused by viruses, like COVID-19. Some diseases are caused by germs, which are different, like bubonic plague. Some diseases are caused by prions, like mad cow, which are really parts of viruses. What we do with crime is one way to break it down, certainly not the only way, is to break it down into these 6 categories that your book focuses on: violent crime, property crime, public order crime, white-collar crime, organized crime, high-tech crime. So again, these are not the only categories that you could create. Like I have said before, and I will say again, when someone presents you with a list, particularly a short list, one of the things you should engage in is critical thinking and saying, what's been omitted from that list? Why is the list structured that way? Okay, let's jump to the first type of crime. This is the type of crime I would say that most people, when they think about crime, this is the first image that really forms in their minds. And this is violent crime. These are crimes committed typically by one person, sometimes in pairs or with others, but typically by one person against another person, resulting in a physical injury in most cases, or harm. Now, the worst of these will be your homicides. And in North Carolina, what we've done is we've got first-degree homicide, second-degree homicide, voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter. Now, we actually have a number of other charges for homicides in North Carolina. We've got felony death by motor vehicle, which is primarily used for crimes that occur while you are drunk driving. You've got misdemeanor death by motor vehicle, which are crimes that occur while you're doing something other than drunk driving, such as speeding. I am drinking coffee again, so you'll have to pardon the slurping. There's a number of even further crimes, some of which are exceedingly rare. One of my favorite examples, and this is a proof that the general legislature somehow has too much time on its hands sometimes, is if you kill someone using a nuclear weapon. It's a specific crime, weapon of mass destruction in North Carolina. That, frankly, is not going to happen too often. If it does, I think we've got more things to worry about than arresting the people that did it. The other types of serious violent crimes that we could look at, sexual assaults and rapes, and those are 2 distinct categories. North Carolina has some very specific laws in regards to these 2 offenses that I will just mention quickly here. For rape to occur in North Carolina, and generally the types of rape that occur in North Carolina are first-degree rape, second-degree rape, and the statutory rapes. For a rape to occur, there has to be a penetration of a vagina by a penis. If you don't have that, North Carolina categorizes it as a sexual assault. The penalties for first-degree sexual assault and first-degree rape are identical, but North Carolina has separated rape out as a different type of crime. The next type of violent crime is assault and battery, and then we have robbery. But let's circle back 1 second and talk about assault and battery, because again, North Carolina is a little unique here. The traditional, one could say the common approach, not the common law approach, is that an assault is when you threaten to hit someone. So when I cock back my fist to punch you in the nose, that is an assault. When I actually hit you in the nose, bam, that is the battery. So the way to kind of remember that is battery comes after assault, just like B comes after A in the alphabet. Now North Carolina has some quirky laws here again in regards to the language. So if you're looking these things up specifically for North Carolina, you might get a little confused. This is not something that we're going to directly address. This is something more for the criminal law class that you might take at Wake Tech, but we in North Carolina don't tend to use the term battery very much. It's in a few statutes still, but we've replaced it. And what we did is we took the term assault and used it for both assault and what we would call in common law battery. So we have attempted assault and assault in North Carolina, which is the same thing in most places as assault and battery, and I'm sure that's a little confusing. Robbery. Now, robbery is an interesting term legally because it's one of those terms that has come into the common English usage incorrectly. And this is not at all unusual. I'm sure this happens with many, many specific types of vocabulary. But most of the time when you hear someone, I'll be watching the news often with my wife, and the newscaster will say, well, there was a robbery at a liquor store. And I would say, no, there isn't. Not unless, the liquor store is not involved. A robbery is not when you break in someplace and steal something. Okay? A robbery is when you take something physically off someone's body. So that's what's making the violent crime. If I take your wallet by force, if I rip your purse off, if I take a ring off, if I snatch your bracelet, all of those are robberies. And again, different jurisdictions in North Carolina will have different degrees or different specific types of robberies, some making it worse or less, as we do for batteries, by the way, and assaults in North Carolina. All right, property crime. Very, very large. It's the most common type of crime that we could talk about. The motivation typically for property is economic gain. And, that's why people commit many crimes, because they want money, or they want a substitute for money. They want goods. So it's unsurprising that people very often will commit a property crime. Most property crimes are going to be classified then as a larceny, which simply is a taking of property. Now again, if we do this from a person, it's violent crime, it's a robbery. But if we do it from a home, now it's a specific type of crime, it's burglary. You can also have petty larceny. You can have larceny that's with or without force. If you're using force, if it's from the person, it's usually a violent crime. One that many students don't think of, the next major type of property crime, is arson. It's not a taking, but it is a destruction of property. It's a malicious, and malicious means ill will or hatred, a malicious burning of property. So it's one of the major crimes that is tracked in our data, but it's not one that many students think of. The last category here, and again, this is one that we track, and it's an important one for us to track because it's one that we get exceedingly good data on, is motor vehicle theft. Now this is a separate category because, as you know, in America, cars are absolutely vital. Given the absence of effective public transportation, in part because we're so geographically dispersed and in part because of policy choices that are made, most Americans utilize cars more than other societies. The result of which is we really focus on cars. One of the things we do with cars that we don't do with almost any other piece of property is we keep a registry of them. So your cars are all registered. and we imprint them with identification numbers. So every car manufactured after certain dates, of course, has a VIN number, a vehicle identification number, which is present on the engine block. It's present in different places in the car. What this means is if a car gets stolen, there's multiple ways to track it, and there's multiple notifications of it stolen. So motor vehicle theft is one of those thefts that we can keep a really close eye on. We really can know how much motor vehicle theft is occurring. Public order crime. Okay. Public order typically involves a violation of what the public deem to be moral behavior. These can be violent, or they can be just property crime, or they can just involve a person doing something we don't like. Public order crimes are sometimes inexactly, and I would say incorrectly, called victimless crimes. So what are some common ones? Well, the first one I mentioned there in the slide is drunk and disruptive. Now, many states have a public drunkenness statute where it is illegal to be drunk in public. North Carolina doesn't, strictly speaking, make it illegal to be drunk in public. What we do is we make it illegal to be drunk in public and be disruptive, and then disruptive is defined by that. So for example, if you engage in fighting, if you block an entrance or an exit, if you use certain language, make certain threats, all those are deemed to be disruptive. So both of those are present for the crime to occur in North Carolina, and that's a pretty common crime. The next one to talk about is prostitution and assignation, and that's probably a vocabulary word that's good for you to learn. Many of us think about prostitution. Okay, so what's prostitution? Prostitution is when typically we're going to use the common example, although it is involved with different genders, is when a woman sells herself or is sold to a man for sex. So she would be committing the act of prostitution. The person who is purchasing sex directly in an illegal way is committing assignation. So the prostitute is the person selling, the assignate is the person buying. So we call that prostitution, the selling, assignation, the buying. So both of those are crimes. It is both a crime to sell yourself or to sell others if you're a pimp, or to buy, assignation. The third large category there is gambling, and this is a very large category. It's something that goes on quite a bit. Traditionally, this was probably more enforced in the past than it is today, particularly once many forms of legal gambling have come into existence. So we have the lottery number in North Carolina. We have for more than 10 years now, I guess. We've got lots of different ways that you can gamble. Still, some things are illegal in North Carolina. As our example, you can't have slot machines, you can't have roulettes, but obviously different states, and this goes back to that term we talked about in Chapter 1, prostitution assignation, chronocentrism and ethnocentrism. Certain states allow gambling. Some, even deep southern states like Mississippi and Alabama, will have riverboat gambling. Other states allow it landlocked. Nevada is a good example. New Jersey has gambling. Illegal drug use is our fourth category. Now, illegal drug use it really covers a very, very broad, different type of behavior. There's what I would call the kind of black market illegal drug use and the gray market illegal drug use. So let me give you a quick snapshot of those two terms. There are some drugs that are illegal in almost every case in North Carolina. So an example would be heroin, cocaine, marijuana, meth. All of those are black market drugs. People go out, they buy them from an illegal source, and they use them. Both the buying of that and the selling of that is a crime. Now, the gray market drugs are a little bit different. Gray market drugs are drugs that people often will get legally and will sometimes turn around and sell or distribute or give illegally. So an example of that would be a drug like Adderall, or even there is believe it or not, there's a medical cocaine prescription. Um, you could get a prescription to a drug. You could sell the drug. That would make it an illegal drug. So that's gray market. And that happens surprisingly often. The final public order category to talk about is illegal pornography. Now, this is a category I would say what is and is not illegal in a pornographic sense that has been shrinking in the last 20, 30 years. If you think about, if you go back to America just after the close of the First World War, you have a big reaction against public nudity. You have something called the Hays Office comes in that really begins to restrict motion pictures. You have a real campaign against graphical depictions of nudity. And this probably reaches its peak by the 1930s and 40s. And then you have the beginning of the sexual revolution. So by the 1960s, you have magazines like Playboy being published, which some people would call pornography, but is legal pornography. Then you have gradually by the 70s and 80s, you have an even coarsening of the product available. So you have magazines like Penthouse and Hustler. And then, of course, you have the explosion into video and now online. So what's left that's illegal? Well, certainly anything that is a filming of children or non-consensual. And there are certain acts in North Carolina that we will specify cannot be recorded and displayed for profit. The primary one that most people focus upon, the one that certainly is seen to have done the most damage to the participants, would be child pornography. White collar crime. Now, white collar crime, this is crime committed with people who are in a position of economic or political power. And typically it has major impacts but lower penalty. We don't associate white collar crime particularly with violent acts, although, and some of these statistics, in 2017, there were over 5,000 people killed at work, and many of those died because of employer negligence. So if you had, for example, someone running a coal mine who didn't follow proper safety procedures, and some of the miners died, that would be white collar crime. He may or may not be charged with a homicide. He might be charged with a negligence. Typically, that's where it goes. Now, according to the FBI, white collar crime costs over $500 billion annually, and there's a lot that goes into white collar crime versus just $15 billion. So, you know, a significantly smaller number than the white collar crime. Maybe, what, 30%, something like that? No, yeah, that's right. 3%, I'm sorry, 3%. My math's way off. The final one to talk about as the broad organization is organized crime. Organized crime, immediately when I say this, most people will think of the mafia. And historically, there have always been gangs or groups or organizations who will form and commit crimes very often for financial gain, for profit. As I said, classically you have the mafia. That's somewhat of an accident of history. If you went back to America in, say, the 1840s, before the arrival of large numbers of ethnic Italians, the organized crime groups tended to be Dutch, we're talking about New York, Irish, that would be Boston, German, that would be Philadelphia and different locations. It's only by the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, about the 1890s, that we begin to see large numbers of ethnic Italians coming in. And those Italians from particularly Sicily brought in the mafia. But, you know, there were other Italian-centered organized crime groups, some that came out of Naples, some that came out of other areas. But it became the kind of romanticized picture, I think in part because of movies like The Godfather and Godfather 2, and really the birth of TV in many ways. So we have the mafia. The mafia is not, I would say, the premier organized crime organization in the United States anymore. It's been under very heavy attack by the FBI and different agencies for multiple decades, the result of which is, although it clearly still exists, it does not have the same power it used to. Other ethnic groups have emerged. There are Russian mafia groups, there are Jamaican mafia, organized crime groups, there are Colombian organized crime groups, a whole series of ethnic groups. There's Chinese triads, Japanese Yakutska. There's just a ton of these. Typically, how does organized crime make money? Well, they make money from us. The big three things that organized crime does, and these are the big three illegal things that really generate money, are drugs, sex, and lending. So they sell us illegal drugs, they import it and sell it. So you have the Mexican cartels, the Venezuelan cartels bringing drugs in and selling it. You have prostitution rings that are run by organized crime. And one of the big things, and this is again often overlooked by my students, is predatory lending. Loan sharking is the third big component of organized crime. I guess we should address high-tech crime, and I always kind of hesitate to do this because we've created this category, your book creates this category, and it talks about how these are crimes committed with computers and the internet using other tools. And that's great, but I think what you're going to find is that most high-tech crimes have always existed. What you're having really is, as I note there, older crimes being copied and being updated. So you might have the scam, the famous Nigerian prince scan. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, where you get an email from a so-called Nigerian prince who just needs your bank account number so he can move millions of dollars in there and he's going to split it with you. Or the classic pyramid, the Ponzi schemes are done online as well. Many of these are really just things that have existed for a long time. But technology has allowed some refinements, some changing of them enough so that they can be deployed in a wider way. Part of the problem here is that a lot of technology is first adapted by the public and often by criminals before you see an adaptation by the police. So the police are often a little slow getting there, which is understandable because you first have to know the crime occurs and then you have to react to the crime, you have to criminalize it. So an example I could use here is, for a while we were dealing with the problem of illegal designer drugs, where a new drug compound would be manufactured. It would be either an hallucinogenic or a pleasure-deriving drug, but it would not be chemically similar to anything that was illegal. And then people would sell it, and the police would say, well, can you sell that? And they said, well, there's no law against it. Of course I can sell it. So it would take a while for the law and the police to catch up. Okay, some context here for crimes and resources. Because resources are very finite, you have to prioritize what crimes are important and what crimes deserve your resources. So no matter what size budget you talk about, whether it's $100 million, $1 billion, $10 billion, whatever, you're going to have to make a decision. How much of that do I allocate to different crimes? So if you were in charge of fighting crime in Raleigh, North Carolina, people would come to you and they say, okay, how much, you have $100 million. How many millions of dollars do you want to spend fighting prostitution? Okay, I want to spend not much, maybe $5 million. Okay, great. How much do you want to spend investigating burglaries? Well, that's pretty serious. I don't like people breaking home. Let's spend $20 million on that. So you can see that eventually you're going to come and people are going to say, well, how much do you want to spend on computer crime? And you're going to say, well, I don't have the resources. I'm spending all of it on something else. And if you can't go back to your funding source and get more money, then certain crimes are going to be ignored. Also, crimes that we just don't think are important, or victims that we're not interested in protecting too much, or victims that don't have a voice to really draw attention to themselves. Now, typically what the public perceives to be the most common or the most dangerous or the most offensive crimes are prioritized. So there is definitely pressure that is placed on law enforcement, both on the police and on the prosecution, to decide, well, we want you to go after this crime. And sometimes you hear this called the crime of the week. What, you know, what trigger, what happens that people say, oh my God, this is a real crisis, let's deal with it. You know, there's a lot of children being kidnapped, so let's form a children kidnapping task force. There's a lot of illegal immigrants, so let's devote a lot of resources to illegal immigration. There's a lot of counterfeit drugs out there. All right, let's create that. So you do have to remember too sometimes that public opinion is shaped for a purpose. That people might have an agenda. They might say, well, you know, I really want this to become important, so I'm going to report on this a lot, or I'm going to pay people to report on this a lot, or I'm going to make speeches about why this is really, really important. Also, be aware that the public can be wrong about how common a crime is or what the most dangerous crimes are. Very often the public is ill-informed. Doesn't mean that they don't have a legitimate fear or a legitimate interest. What it means is they don't have the correct facts to make their decisions. Okay, how much do you have to steal? One of the examples, before most of you were born, in the 1980s there was what was called the savings and loan crisis. Savings and loans were a particular type of bank that engaged in essentially a massive amount of criminal fraud. How much did it cost? Well, remember when I said all illegal crime in 2017, which is almost 40 years after this, at least 30 years after this, was 15 billion. Well, there was about 132 billion dollars that went missing from these banks. So who got prosecuted? Well, only about 20 to 25, almost 30% of bankers who stole over $10 million were referred for prosecution. Of the roughly 1,000 defendants, only 580 were convicted, 450 went to prison. Now, contrast that with the typical conviction rates for other criminals, where it's about 99.8% after 2005. So, it's hard to see how certain crimes you can't say that we're just not interested in prosecuting certain crimes, or they're difficult, or there's no appetite to do it, even when hundreds of billions of dollars are stolen. All right, I've been talking a lot about crimes, but one of the things I think that's fair to ask here is, how do we know how many crimes are being committed? So the United States is very lucky in that since the 1930s, the FBI has been compiling reports on crime in the United States. Starting in the 1930s, the FBI went around to local police agencies. They went to departments like the Raleigh Police Department, or Durham, or Lizard Lick, or Fuquay, or Fayetteville, and they said, we would like you to send in a report to us. We would like you to send in a report of crimes, and we're going to talk about how that report is divided in a minute, but crimes that are reported, crimes that you solved. And then we are going to prepare a yearly report or summary of this. And the nice thing about this is, if you look at the United States in 1930, 1940, there's about 150 million Americans living in it. Look at America in 2020, there's about 327 million Americans living in it, I believe. So there's more than twice as many. So if you were going to compare crime rates, instantaneously the first problem you'd have would be, well, there's twice as many people. So how do we handle that? Well, the nice thing about the UCR is they do give you the raw numbers. You can look at the raw numbers, but they also give you a rate. So they say this is how many homicides occurred, this is how many rapes occurred, this is how many burglaries occurred per 100,000 in the population. So the first thing it allows you to do is compare data across time, which is really nice for us. And then if you think about it, since you're getting a number per 100,000 generated in Raleigh, you can compare that to per 100,000 in rural Montana. You could take a circle, draw it around and say, okay, 100,000 people live in this area. This is the crime rate in Montana. We can compare Montana to Raleigh or New York City to Raleigh. It divides crime, the UCR, Uniform Crime Report, into two major categories, what are called Part 1 offenses, which are your most serious offenses. Those are the ones almost everybody tracks. And Part 2 offenses, which are the less serious offenses. Okay, so what's the Part 1 offenses? Here's the big one, murder, or more properly, homicide. Self-explanatory, we've talked a lot about these. Then we go to forcible rape or sexual assault. And you'll notice that term forcible rape could raise some questions. Robbery, we've talked about that. Aggravated assault, which is a more serious type of assault, not what in North Carolina would be simple assault. If I just slapped you, not hurting you in any way, but if I slapped you, it is a crime in North Carolina. Aggravated assault would be if I stabbed you. That would be an example. Burglary, and then larceny, which is a theft. The Part 2 offenses are less serious, so they typically have lower penalties, but it's still stuff we like to see and look at. Drug use, simple assaults, DUI, DWI. Now, those terms get used essentially interchangeably because different jurisdictions use them in different ways. Sometimes we'll call it driving under the influence. Sometimes we'll call it driving while intoxicated. Still is a shorthand for drunk driving. Now, the data is not complete. Only arrests are reported as completed, and about 10 million Part 2 offenses are reported annually. So what's some of the problems with this data? Because no piece of data is perfect. Well, first of all, it's only got summary data. It doesn't have a lot of individualized data you can't go into. Here's a big one. Definitions of crimes can vary between states. Let me give you a quick example. Suppose you were tracking statutory rape between Alabama and Alaska. Well, Alabama might set the age of sexual consent at 14, and Alaska might set the age of sexual consent at 16. Therefore, since it'd be easier to commit statutory rape in Alaska, because there'd be more people under 16, it'd be harder to commit it in Alabama, you would have different rates. So there can be problems there. It could even be a problem of how we define, like North Carolina I talked about, defining sexual assaults. Here's the big one though. It only includes crimes reported to the police. So besides making something a crime, you have to detect the crime occurs. I often say the most successful criminals ever are the ones that commit crimes and no one knows the crime was committed. So let's suppose someone has broken into the Louvre and stolen the Mona Lisa and replaced it with a copy. If no one knows about this, that's the most successful crime that's ever occurred. Federal crimes are not reported in this way. The other thing about this is these are voluntary, and some departments do not submit reports regularly. For example, for about 5 years, Pittsburgh did not report homicides to the FBI. For different reasons why different departments will do this, sometimes politically, sometimes it's a technical issue. So about 80 homicides go unreported. So the data is not perfect. No data selection is perfect. So because there were some problems with this, we began to engage in fixes of the UCR. And the fix is called the National Incident-Based Reporting System, the NIBRS. And we still call it the UCR, even though we have the NIBRS. What it did is it included more crimes, it allowed more electronic submission, it attempted to standardize certain categories, and it really has corrected some of the problems we just talked about. Not perfect, but it's certainly reformed some. However, remember I said one of the big issues is crime has to be reported for it to show up on the UCR. So let's suppose that you're in class one day and someone steals your pen. It's just a regular pen. You know someone took it because you had it. There were 2 or 3 people near you. Someone stole your pen. You're not going to report that crime. That crime will go unreported. It occurred, it was a larceny, but it'll go unreported. Now that's a minor crime, but you can create scenarios in which important crimes would not get reported. Suppose you were someplace buying drugs. You were going to buy some marijuana from your dealer. You go to his house and while you're in the house, someone steals money from you, steals $500, okay? You're not going to go to the police and say, hey, I was buying drugs at my drug dealer's house and I got ripped off. I'd like you to go arrest this guy. So crime that occurs but doesn't get reported is called the dark figure of crime. And one of the ways that you can try to detect this is you can use what's called the NCVS, National Crime Victims Survey. Now, first of all, let me say that this is one of the largest surveys that is conducted in the United States. This is not, like if you see a survey on the news or on the internet, very often they've polled 300 or 400 people. This is 70,000 people answering questions, 40,000 households answering questions. So it's a massive, massive amount. And what it shows, at least in some, but this is changing, is that the dark figure of crime is up to twice what the UCR shows. At one time, like I said, they were pretty far apart, but now we begin to see that this data is getting closer. I think I got a slide view. Here we go. If you look at how these rates are converging, if you looked at back in the 70s, the difference between the National Crime Victim Survey showing a higher rate and the UCR showing a lower, and you look over time, you can see how these are getting closer and closer and closer. In fact, for motor vehicle theft, you'll notice for a while there that it is actually higher in the UCR than in the NCVS, and that's the only time that really occurs. There is an absence there, you know, the most important crime, the crime that most people tend to chart, which is homicide. It's not tracked in the National Crime Victim Survey because you can't call people up and say, hey, were you the victim of murder? So we look at it, and like I said, the rates at one time were very far apart. The rates now are much closer. So the dark figure of crime, the good news is it's shrinking. Okay, now of course, I want you to look at this slide. What the public believes is different. The red line there that you're seeing is the National Crime Victim Survey violent crimes. So you're looking at the crime rate as reported. And remember, that should be high, higher than if we looked at the UCR, although it will track the UCR rate. So if we take that as the crime rate, you'll notice that through the 1990s, people pretty much understood that crime yeah, I understand where crime is, but now look what happens. The public perception of crime begins to split from the actual rate. So if we go to 2015, which is the last date on this slide, you'll notice that the national crime per 1,000 individuals aged 12 and over, you're going to be at a reporting rate of about 20%, but the perception is that crime is closer to 70%. So even though statistically we now know that crime has shrunk, both because it's been reported in the UCR that way and reported by the National Crime Victim Survey that way, the public doesn't know this. The public believes crime is up. The public believes crime is worse. It simply isn't, and that's a problem. Crime rates are falling dramatically. Let's look at this chart here. We know that crime in the United States, although there's some little variation, you notice there was a big peak in the early 80s, but pretty much it went up and up and up to the 80s. It went along a plateau to about 1980 and then started a rather precipitous decline. So if we look at whatever you want, we got really good data for motor vehicle theft, pretty good data for burglary, good data for larceny, totally property crimes. You'll notice that they've all fallen about 50%. So you know, crime's down 50%. This is a wonderful success. There's lots of different reasons for this. So what are some of the reasons your book offers? And I'm going to list these for you, although I have some real problems with them. So more police on the street, okay, fall of crime. More federal aid, okay. More felons locked up, all right. Decline in the crack cocaine epidemic, gotcha. Deployment of tools like CompStat and better security technology. I'm going to say, and this is something that you don't have to take Professor Chapman's teaching as gospel here. You need to go out and find it yourself, that many of these explanations aren't very good. In particular, I want you to think about the role of the police in reducing crime, because one of the things, we're coming up on election year shortly, and you're going to hear people talking about, I'm going to put more cops in the street to reduce crime. Remember, that doesn't reduce crime. You may catch people who commit crime, but it doesn't directly reduce crime. The crime has already occurred when the police get involved. What we're looking for is something that doesn't catch the guy who does it, but prevents the guy from doing it. Now, you might come back and say, well, the same people commit all the crimes. That might be true of some crimes. There might be some people that commit a lot of crimes, and if you catch them, you would reduce the overall crime rate. But let's take homicide as our example. And homicide, again, like the other ones, has fallen dramatically. Almost no one, statistically, commits more than one murder. Most murders are a one-off. There are serial killers we could talk about, pretty freakishly rare. But most people, when they kill, commit one. So that's going to mean that catching a murderer by itself, since he doesn't repeat, doesn't help you that much. Now, the decline of the crack cocaine epidemic. This is something that's pretty discredited by this point. The idea that crack cocaine fueled a massive increase in crime. Well, it certainly fueled massive incarceration, but there is not a lot of data to show that crack cocaine by itself drove crime rates. More felons being incarcerated. I think that's a fair thing to look at. We did lock a lot more people up. Again, though, I think we begin to have a problem there. Does that really lower crime rate? Does locking people up lower crime rates? It's true if the same people commit multiple crimes, if you have high recidivism rates. It'd be true if you weren't letting people out, but people are getting out. It's not a great measurement. It's probably somewhat responsible to a small percentage. Now, the better data-driven is more interesting. I think that's got a little bit more to it. I think CompStat and the deployment of certain technologies really have begun to take a bite out of crime. So what are some things, and this is some of these things are going to be a little bit controversial, and this is really micro lecture 2, but these are some reasons why crime might have fallen between the 1980s and the 2000s, some of which might be a surprise to you. Legalizing abortion, the demographic decline of young adults, environmental improvements, rise of income, and surprisingly, increased immigration. Now, some of those things should really be hot button issues for some of you. You might say, well, what is he talking about? Well, if you want to find out more, I'm going to ask that you watch the lecture, Micro Lecture 2.1 on unique or unusual reasons why we might have experienced this decline in crime. Okay, not all groups have seen the same decline in crime. For example, minorities based upon race. Racial minorities show higher rates of victimization and higher rates of arrest. So more racial minorities have become victims of crime than whites, and more racial minorities have become are arrested as criminals, as percentages. Class. Again, the wealthier you are, the more isolated you've been from crime. Ethnicity is a little bit more difficult to study. It's difficult to measure ethnicity, and only now are we starting to see the impact on ethnic groups. And this is something I'm not going to go deeply into because I don't think it's well addressed. And frankly, I don't think it's really a topic that we have good data to talk about right now. Okay, women in crime is certainly something we should mention. Crime is a male-dominated activity. About 15% of jail populations, and that's going to be people typically, but not always, who commit minor crimes, are women. And 7% of prison populations, and those are going to be people that commit felonies or serious crimes. So we could say that 85% of the minor crimes are committed by men, and 93% of the serious crimes are committed by men. So Women are involved in about 26% of arrests, but they don't tend to wind up in jail very often or prison. However, having said that, they are increasing as a percentage. If the numbers aren't going up, the percentage of women as a whole is. All right, this brings up a term, criminology, that really is kind of one of the newer sciences that exists, social sciences that exist. We teach a separate course on this at Wake Tech, criminology. It's generally taught by my good friend Amin Asfari. I highly recommend you do it, take the course. But what it is the study of crime and what causes crime. And I sometimes get students who say, well, what do I care about all these theories, Mr. Chapman? These are just theories. These are just guesses. To which I reply, this is why it's important. If you can figure out what causes crime, what the root cause or causes are, then you're halfway to finding a solution. It's just like a disease. If you know what germ or virus causes the disease you're trying to cure, you know what approaches to take to fix it, or you can start. So there are multiple theories as to why crime occurs or why people commit crimes. We can talk about genetic predisposition towards crime. We can talk about cultural norms, personal choice, medical issues, or mental issues. So one of the things I ask you to understand here, because we're starting to talk about theory and we're starting to talk about causation and correlation in a modern scientific sense, and students very often confuse correlation and causation. So these are two things going into looking at theories that you need to separate in your mind. Correlation means that there is a relationship between the two things, that they move in the same direction. So causation is this thing triggers the other. Correlation means these two things occur at the same time. Simply because two things occur at the same time does not mean one causes the other. Correlation is not causation. And very often there are multiple things going on. So the difficult thing about causation of an event, particularly a very complex event like committing a crime, is there's probably multiple factors going into it, multiple causations. And there are probably multiple correlations that come out of it. So it's difficult to prove what directly causes criminal behavior. All right, the other thing I beg you to understand is the difference between how science uses the term theory and how popular culture uses it. Even I use it in common conversation. So what is the modern scientific definition of theory? Well, the National Academy of Sciences says a theory is, quote, some scientific explanations that are so well established that no new evidence is likely to alter them. Theory is a comprehensive explanation of an important feature of nature supported by facts gathered over time. And theories then allow scientists to make predictions about future events. So what are some theories, and how do I want you to think about theory? Well, think about first a very simple one that we all take for granted, the theory of gravity. Do we know everything about gravity? We do not. We're kind of unsure how it's generated. We're kind of unsure whether it's wave or associated. Needn't go into that. But we understand a lot of the basics of it, and no one is going to overturn the basic theories of gravity. There can be changes to it. There might be some huge change, but it's so unlikely that we can say that gravity is an established theory. It is not a guess. A guess is kind of closer to a hypothesis. So let me give you a scientific modern theory in criminal justice, the theory of fingerprints. We believe, and it is well established, and it is unlikely that any new evidence will alter them, that it is almost impossible for two people to share the same fingerprints. The statistical probabilities are ridiculously small, So we now say with a high degree of confidence that fingerprints are unique. Now, the difference between the popular theory and the modern scientific use of the term theory, you can probably see it best in TV shows where someone says, well, I have a theory about, what happened here. Well, that really means you got to guess. And guesses are nice. Guesses can lead us to the truth. Guesses can point us in directions, but it's not the scientific use of the term theory. Theories are robust. They have strong evidence to support them. Hypotheses are possible explanations that can be tested. And sometimes a hypothesis, as it's supported, as it's developed, as it matures, can become a theory. And other times it will be challenged and it'll say, well, this hypothesis just isn't worth studying anymore because it's not true. Now we come to lecture 2.2. Many older theories, some of which we're going to talk about here briefly, developed when science itself was less rigorous, less developed. And over time, even though they've maintained the term theory behind their name, they've really been discredited, or they've been altered or proved true in very modified states. So some examples are, I mentioned one, the theory of gravity. The theory of gravity begins to develop very early on. I mean, it's kind of mentioned by the Greeks, but certainly Sir Isaac Newton is credited with a lot of this. And Newton was writing in the 1600s, and we've learned a lot since then, so it's really changed. Theories, older theories, probably prior to the 20th century, we can say you need to take a good hard look at them to see if they really meet the modern definition of theory. Okay, so what causes crime? Let's look at some of the theories that developed. And again, some of these are older theories. Some of them we still practice today. The first one is rational choice. And I very intentionally put this one first. It's very popular. It's something I think that many Americans embrace. It makes a degree of intuitive sense. So common sense often appeals to us. Rational choice is very, very popular. And what it says is that if you ask the question, what causes crime? The answer comes back, people. People choose to commit crime. And on the surface, that's pretty much undeniable. I think the question becomes, is there anything underneath that? Like, why did people choose to commit crime? But some people simply choose to end the explanation there. Why do people commit crime? They choose to commit crime. Therefore, let's set up a system to punish them when they choose it, and let's set up a system to convince them not to choose it. Well, that's great, but if you don't ask some of the underlying questions, I don't think it gets you too terribly far. I think it's a very surface explanation. All right, now trait theories show links between things like genetics and brain chemistry or other psychological conditions. I'm going to refer to psychological theories in a moment. But these, again, some of these started off very early on with very crude science and I think very inexact science and came with some certainly ridiculous ideas. There were some so-called scientists, they weren't really scientists, who tried to create a science called phrenology. Phrenology is feeling the bumps on people's heads to determine what they're like. And it ain't gonna tell you anything, but there you can see these charts and graphs of people okay, you've got a little bump here, and that means you're more likely, impulsive, and you got a little dip in your skull there, and that means you might be suffering from melancholia. It's pretty weird. Psychological theory can look at things like thoughts and emotions and behaviors. That's kind of opposed to trait theory in some ways. Psychological looks more at the mind and its expression. Trait theory tends to look more at the body. Those are internal theories. Then you can look at external theories, and these are theories that don't just focus on the individual. They focus on what's happening around the individual. So if rational choice is kind of in the middle, rational choice says you choose, that's it. We're not going to look why you chose internally. We're not going to look at why you chose externally. Well, the crimes I just talked about, the theories looked at internal theory of crime, psychological, physiological crime. These look at external things. like social disorganization or strain theory or social conflict theory. These are all theories that say, what's the environment like that the individual is living in? Is something in the environment leading him to be more susceptible to committing crime? Is he being raised in a bad environment? Is he being raised in a violent environment? And then you have, again, this is an external explanation, learning theory or control theory or life course theory. So let's just take one of those, the learning theory. This says that crime is learned behavior. You have to be taught crime. So if you've ever known anybody that smoked a cigarette or drank a beer, which I'm sure none of you ever have, you have to kind of be taught how to light a cigarette. You have to be taught to appreciate a beer. Probably the first time you ever have a sip of beer, or certainly a sip of whiskey or a puff of a cigarette, it's not necessarily a pleasant experience, but you learn to appreciate it. So the same thing could be said of crime. How do you learn to commit crime? How do you learn to do that? And of course, once you learn it, how do you stop it? Now, one of the things I'm going to talk about in the next micro lecture, and this actually should be micro lecture 2.2, not 2.1. I'll change that in the next slide series, is the rational choice theory. So I'm really going to focus on that in about a 5-minute lecture because I think it's pretty important for you to get a handle on it. But rational choice, very important. Okay. Coming up kind of on the end here, we're coming up to our hour, and I like to try to keep these in an hour or so. The victim. In the past, criminologists really hadn't focused much on the victim, but in the last decade or two, the science of victimology, looking at the victim, has become much, much more popular. And the relationship between victims and offenders and the interaction between the criminal justice system and the victims have really become more studied. And we look at things like, why do people become victims? And let me tell you a little personal story. I used to represent clients. Sometimes I would represent women who were in battered relationships or children that were in abused relationships because I was a guardian ad litem a couple times. And one of the things that is an absolute truth is that women can be in relationships predominantly. I mean, I know it happens with opposite genders, but women can be in relationships that become abusive and can repeat that pattern or can become victims multiple times. And then the question becomes, well, why? I'm not trying to blame the woman. I'm asking the question, why is the woman the victim multiple times? What process is ongoing? Are predators somehow identifying them as weak and susceptible to victimization? Are they failing themselves to identify people who might be victimizers? So we look at things like, what are likely offenders like? What are suitable targets like? What is the presence or the absence of a capable guardian? How does repeat victimization play into this? And what is the connection between the offender and the victim? So, men are more common both as victims and as perpetrators than you think. But women do face unique dangers. Our estimates are that about 90% of sexual violent victims are women. Now, some of that probably has to do with the reporting era, but certainly it's more common. And you know, at the root of this, you've got a physiological difference of the strength between men and women. Well, it's certainly possible that a woman could defend herself against most men. My daughter, for example, has a black belt in Taekwondo, and she could probably easily defend herself against most men. But most women cannot physically defend themselves against most men. And that means they are more likely, in a certain sense, to be a probable victim. So we can look at things like domestic violence and stalking, and we can see that men are often the dominant perpetrators of these crimes. Okay, other groups that are vulnerable, the mentally ill. Mentally ill people, I think in the past, were often viewed as perpetrators, as predators. But in fact, those that are mentally ill in the society are less likely to be the perpetrators of crime and more likely to be the victims of crime. So one of the things that we can do to reduce crime, if we're interested, is we can establish a system of treatment for the mentally ill. This prevents them from becoming victims, makes it much less likely they become so, and much more likely that we can prevent the crime. I put this chart in here because even though I said the mentally ill are less likely to become victims of crime, they are not less likely to be incarcerated. If you look at this chart here, and if you look back to the 1960s, you'll notice that this green line has the percentage of the population, or the raw numbers of institutional per 100,000 adults in prison and jail. It's about 200. So then you look at the percentage that is in a mental institution, and you'll notice it's about 600. So it's about 3 times as many people were locked up in mental institutions for issues. And those could be issues like schizophrenic behavior, delusional behavior, even if it was nonviolent. Starting in the 1960s, we began the process of deinstitutionalization. We closed our major medical hospitals that were devoted to mental illness. A good example here in Raleigh, Dorothy Dix here used to operate a very large psychiatric ward. And pretty much now there's only a handful of people, I don't even know if there's anybody left at Dix now, left in Dix. They've closed the large state mental hospitals. Now, mental illness didn't disappear from our society. So the mentally ill had to go someplace. Sometimes they became the victims of crime, sometimes they wound up being incarcerated. So if you look at this chart, the overall chart, the combined rate, okay, didn't change, except you'll notice that the people in mental hospitals almost disappear and the number of people in prisons goes up. If we assume that the same number, about 600 per 100,000, of people that are mentally ill are still in society, then a fair number of those are now in prisons. Not necessarily because they became more violent, but because they committed acts that now we incarcerate you for. And then that begs the question, if we weren't doing that, would our crime rate be even more dramatically lower than it is today? All right, drugs and crime, everybody's favorite whipping boy, all the way from the Just Say No campaigns to marijuana assassin of use. First, remember drugs, and I talked a little bit about the learning theory. Drugs are a learned process. Learn to use, learn to perceive, learn to enjoy the social experience. And there are lots of theories that explain why people do it. Social disorganization, control theory, rational choice raises its head again. I think it's fair to say, though, that there's emerging consensus, particularly in regards to vulnerability to drug addiction, that there's strong physiological, strong genetic and physical reasons why people become addicted to drugs, whether they use them or not. So we do have to caution between addiction and dependency. Most people who use drugs do not abuse them, but a fair percentage will become addicted and will become abusers. So it might surprise you to learn that, or maybe it won't surprise you to learn, let's take a relatively harmless drug. Many people can smoke marijuana recreationally, but some people will become abusers of it, will use it too much. And then we have to ask questions, how does addiction arise? Now, I'm going to introduce a really expensive word, what my old professor used to call a $100 word, psychopharmacological crime. Psychopharmacological crime. This is crime that you commit while you're doing a drug because you're on the drug. So you take a drug and you think you're now Buzz Lightyear and you're trying to help Woody. And in fact, you're beating up somebody. That's psychopharmacological crime. That type of crime is really rare. Most other crime it's a drug crime because you bought the drug or you're using the drug. So we can look at different types of drug crime relationships. We can look at that gray market I talked about earlier, which is prescription drug abuse. We can look at the very definite black market in drugs like meth and heroin, and then we can look at the kind of middle path that we're exploring marijuana with legalization. One of the lectures, I'm going to check these numbers here. One of the lectures is the Portuguese experiment. Now, I'm going to ask this later in the semester, but I'm going to introduce the idea here. About close to 20 years ago now, Portugal legalized all drugs. Not, well, decriminalized is the better term. Not just marijuana like is going on in the United States, but heroin, meth, crack, you name it, decriminalized. And the results of this were very interesting, and I think it's something that you might want to check out in one of the micro lectures. All right, that keeps me right about an hour and 5 minutes or so. That's chapter 2, and I will catch up with you in chapter 3 coming up.